Hey everyone! So an idea that I've had for a while is that I've wanted to try and do a ranking of every single boss in Cuphead from worst to best, since it's one of my favorite games ever. And I still definitely want to do that at some point, but I also don't want to take too much focus away from my big ranking project right now, which is writing my big Mario Kart Cup ranking special. And I'm also working on another big ranking project, ranking all the courses in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, so I've decided to hold off on it at least for now. Watch me decide one day randomly that I want to make it and then just write the entire thing in like a week. I still really wanted to make some Cuphead videos though, and so I decided, hey, why not just write a full video where I can talk about one of my favorite bosses in the game? There's enough content there to warrant a full video, I think. So I decided to start making a whole video essay on the final boss of Cuphead, the delicious last course, that being Chef Saltbaker and a dish to die for. One of my favorite bosses in Cuphead, and one of my favorites in any video game ever made. I want to do a deep dive into this whole boss fight because it is excellent and this game's magnum opus in my opinion. And that's saying a lot because like I said, I love this game. I think it's one of the most impressive indie games available right now, bolstering a gorgeous 2D hand-drawn aesthetic meant to evoke the same feeling as early Technicolor cartoons, and you can tell that every single frame took so much effort to create. On top of the phenomenal soundtrack that is genuinely one of the best OSTs to any game ever made in my opinion. On top of the super creative boss design that's just so endlessly charming. I mean, you fight a psychic carrot, a blimp that turns into the moon, a German war rat, an undead train, a dice that's also a literal personification of gambling. I mean, who comes up with this stuff? When done right, a boss rush can be one of my favorite styles of game, and they absolutely knock it out of the park here. It also strikes the right balance between being gruelingly difficult, while still being fair and extremely satisfying to play. It controls like a dream, there's a weapon and charm for pretty much every playstyle, making it so that you can essentially play exactly the way that you want. I really want to make more videos on this game in the future. There's just so much to talk about, and that's not even getting into the delicious last course, which released in 2022, which somehow takes essentially the perfect game and manages to elevate it in nearly every way, with animation that's somehow even more beautiful, a soundtrack that's now bolstered by a full orchestra with songs that fit each boss perfectly, even more weapons and charms including Miss Chalice, who adds a unique moveset that makes this section of the game such a treat to play, and of course our subject for today, Chef Saltbaker. When you first meet this guy, it's when you first arrive at Inkwell Isle 4. Chalice brings Cuphead and Mugman a magic cookie that as far as I know lets her swap mortal planes with them or something like that, and then tells you that the only one who was able to figure out how to do this was Chef Saltbaker, the greatest chef in all the lands. And at first he seems rather unassuming, even seeming rather pleasant. He proclaims how the cookie has worked wonders on Chalice, only for her to get turned back into a ghost. He then explains how the effects of the cookie are temporary, and then in order to make her turn into a mortal permanently, he needs to bake a special recipe called the Wonder Tart. Also, shout out for Google Docs for constantly reminding me that Wonder Tart is not, in fact, a real word. Thanks, Google, I didn't know that. Only problem is, the recipe contains ingredients that are held by some of the most fearsome foes on the island. So, Cuphead and Mugman decide that they'll find those ingredients if it means bringing back Chalice, and return to their days of soul collecting. And then Saltbaker kinda just chills in his bakery for a while he waits for you to beat up all the bosses on the isle. But if you talk to him again, he'll warn you that getting each ingredient will be a test of wit and wills, but that like any good bake, the key ingredient is heart and soul. Clearly not foreshadowing anything for later. Then if you talk to him again, he claims that he'll be perfecting his recipe while you're out, and says that he knows that you'll put yourself fully into bringing the Wonder Tart to life. Yep, not foreshadowing anything, absolutely nothing. Then he just sends you off and says, now where did I put the salt? Which is actually pretty funny, good meme game. Then he just waits for you till you get all the ingredients, those being gnome berries from Glumstone the Giant, distillery dough from the Moonshine Mob, pineapple mint from the Howling Aces, icy sugar cubes from Mortimer Freeze, and desert limes from Esther Winchester. It's worth noting that by the time you play through all these, Saltbaker is pretty much the most normal guy you've come across. I mean, pretty much everyone you fight is morally questionable in some way. You've got a giant who appears to have no concern for any living creature but himself, and also has all these gnomes employed. Slavery? A gang of bootlegging bugs making illegal moonshine, only real 1920s kids will remember this one. A cowgirl who's on the run from the law, a cult leader, and a group of dogs who seemingly illegally dogfight for fun. Chef Saltbaker is pretty much the nicest guy that you meet aside from the king, and while that doesn't really make his twist the least obvious thing in the world, it still effectively sets him up in a way, considering that turns out he's probably the most sick and evil person on the island when it comes down to it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about the lead up to this incredible fight just a little bit more. After you beat all the other bosses, Chalice tells you to head back to Saltbaker's bakery, and when you walk in, the music is distorted and a little bit broken. And then you drop into the basement where the music abruptly changes. And this track, titled The Finishing Touch, really does an amazing job at selling the uncertainty of the moment. I mean, just listen to this. Like I said, the delicious last course is amazingly scored, and this lead-up track to Saltbaker's fight is no exception. It almost feels like a little bit of a preview for Breaking the Wonder Tart in a way, remixing Saltbaker's theme into a more sinister, unsettling version, having the guitar and pizzicato strings trade the melody back and forth. And then when the voices come in with the lead-in from the strings, it's just so perfect. Sends shivers down my spine and fits this cutscene perfectly. I believe the words that they're saying are Cate Cave Mortem, which is the name of the previous track in the official OST, and is Latin for Beware of Death, which is a little on the nose, but still quite effective. Also, I do want to point out that while I was listening to the OST version of this song, I noticed that if you listen kind of closely, it sounds like one of the flutes keeps accidentally coming in early. Shout out to that one flute player, because that's the realest thing ever. I don't know if that's what actually happened or if it was just like an editing issue or something. But either way, it's still pretty funny, and now that I've started noticing it, I can't unhear it. Anyway, back to the cutscene itself. I just had to talk about that song for a minute because it's super well done and sets up the moment perfectly. You walk through what appears to be some sort of dungeon and find Saltbaker laughing evilly. And when you enter his room, you see that his eyes have turned yellow, almost demonic and feral in a way, where he taunts you by calling you meddlesome brats and says that he didn't think you'd be back so soon. He turns to you, his eyes almost glowing, and he says that it's too late to stop him now and that the Wonder Tart will be his finest work yet. He then reveals that whoever you currently have sent to the spirit realm, so for example if Cuphead is using the Chalice Cookie, then Cuphead would be in the spirit realm, actually got nabbed by Saltbaker while they were in soul form. He reveals that he needs a living soul in order to finish his recipe, and that once the soul is baked into the Wonder Tart, he will have full control over the astral plane. There's Cuphead, fully prepared to put his heart and soul into the Wonder Tart. And then he tells you that he'll take your ingredients and use your heads as serving dishes. And then finally, after all that preamble, you get thrown into the most insane fight in the game. Keep in mind that I'm going to be analyzing this boss fight in regular mode because I don't play expert mode, because I don't hate myself. In the first phase, Saltbaker uses the ingredients you've collected throughout your journey against you, tossing the sugar cubes in a wave pattern, tossing the limes like boomerangs, sending living animal crackers prancing towards you from the dough, and dropping the strawberries on you from the sky. And while this all sounds kinda goofy, it's done in the most disturbing way an E10 game will allow by having all the food be actually alive. He hits the giant sugar cube with a mallet while it looks around worriedly, squeezes the basket of berries and sends it running off crying, straight up commits genocide on the limes, and flattens the dough and cuts pieces out of its literal face. And the animations here are already some of the smoothest and most impressive in the whole game. The utter joy this guy gets out of killing this food for sport is apparent on his face the whole time, and his idle animation is genuinely also a little creepy. The attacks themselves feel quite dynamic also, since he'll send one attack at you while another is still ending, meaning that you have to find a way to dodge both at the same time. Plus there's this little fireball thing that jumps from the ceiling and can easily mess you up if you aren't careful. On top of that, the music in this section is great. It feels like what a finishing touch was leading up to. And a good thing to mention is that the music dynamically changes depending on which phase that you're on, and each one fits perfectly. It's genuinely one of my favorite boss themes from any video game just because of the journey it takes you on, whether you're hearing it in-game or out of game. The section feels appropriately evil, with the organ being the main instrument and the choir literally singing what sounds like Cuphead, You're Dead at the beginning. It feels far more chaotic and imposing than any other song we've heard in the soundtrack thus far, taking a much different vibe with the whole orchestra and choir replacing the big band energy we've had pretty much the whole time. And if you're missing that energy, don't worry, because right after you beat this phase, Saltbaker quite literally has you in the palm of his hand now, and it's impossible to attack him directly. Instead, you have to attack his little pepper shaker minions who keep sneezing spices at you, and when you kill them, they go flying straight towards Saltbaker. Additionally, the fireball you were dodging before is now on the ground, meaning that you have to dodge under it rather than jumping over. And plus, the whole time, Saltbaker is seasoning both you and the Wonder Tart with some mint, which you also have to dodge. This phase is just insane, especially considering how utterly immense Saltbaker is now. He's practically the size of the whole bakery, and his face takes up pretty much half of the entire background as he stares menacingly at you. His face slowly cracking, which is kinda creepy if you think about it. I mean, by anthropomorphic salt shaker logic, his skin is literally coming off throughout the battle. And remember that big band energy I mentioned earlier? Well, it's back during this phase in full force, featuring the fiddle and vibraphone players playing the hardest solos of their entire lives. And all the while, there's utter chaos behind them. I know that people will often say the studio was in flames, as a joke, to mean that the song was super fire or something. But here it literally sounds like the studio is in flames, and the musicians are all running around frantically, and all the while the soloists are just absolutely going off. It perfectly fits here and adds so much frantic energy to this entire part. After you've hit Saltbaker with enough pepper shakers, he begins to crack and chatter, and everything slowly turns white as you're whisked away into Saltbaker's remains. But he isn't done with you yet. As you stand among the remains of the bakery, Saltbaker's cracked and broken corpse visible in the background and the entire ground covered with salt as far as the eye can see. A razor blade travels across the ground and a salt statue of two dancing Saltbakers comes down from the sky and bounces around you. This is sort of an interlude between the insanity that just finished and all the insanity that's soon to follow, but I do want to point out one thing. The death screen here is possibly the most haunting one of them all in this battle, saying your futile efforts were in vain, this world shall be my salt domain. Even after death, you're still trapped by him, and you're still in the evil domain that he created himself. Then after you shoot this dancing statue a little bit, you get sent to the final phase. The ground gives out beneath you, and a giant Saltbaker reconstructed from salt terraforms enormous salt pillars, all with his distorted face on them. You have to jump between broken glass platforms, trying to avoid sinking into the bottom, and all the while you have to shoot what appears to be Saltbaker's soul. This is possibly the most intense part of the whole battle, considering how perilous the platforming can be, and the fact that you've already made it so far, added on to how genuinely haunting the visuals can be. It truly feels like Saltbaker's final hurrah, where he's throwing all of his power at you and literally sending his soul to try and hopefully finish you off. And the music matches all of this so well, starting off as a rendition of Saltbaker's theme with the strings, before evolving and becoming much more chaotic, before swelling and becoming almost epic in a way. There's also a whole other section here that you usually wouldn't hear in the game, but still fits very well, feeling almost hopeful but still quite perilous, which is warranted considering how far you've come. Then there's also another section that's pretty much only possible to hear in the OST, that goes so unbelievably hard, but I do kind of understand why it's not in the game, since I don't really see it fitting anywhere considering how the boss is right now. And then the instrumentation gets lower and lower, until it's only the organ playing, ending the song in a peaceful, almost retrospective type of way. Right before it hits you with the special knockout sound for Saltbaker. It's just so epic and one of the greatest bosses and greatest songs in all of gaming. After the fight ends, we get treated with another animated cutscene, and the neat thing about this one is that the music actually matches up with the speed of the cutscene. It's just such a small but neat detail that they didn't have to do, but it makes this game feel so much more put together as a result. Saltbaker is defeated, yet still alive somehow after all that. The bakery starts coming down and everyone escapes, leaving the bakery to collapse. This means that Chalice won't ever get the Wonder Tart, but she decides that she'd rather not have it if it means another soul has to be sacrificed, but that she'll never stop searching. Then we get treated to a little epilogue, showing that Saltbaker got sentenced to community service, which seems like letting him off a little easy for a little attempted murder, but whatever. In all fairness, he does get to learn his lesson by actually bonding with the other people on the island and doing work for them, which is clever since before he only really seemed to consider them as obstacles. The song that plays here is also pretty good and serves as a nice wrap-up to the whole thing before the actual credits kick in. That song is incredible too, but that's a whole other story. All in all, I think all that this video really did to me was prove that Saltbaker is definitely my favorite boss in Cuphead. I was unsure about it before this, but I think this really seals the deal. So if I do end up making that boss ranking I talked about, most of you will probably only have to go into it expecting to see what gets second place, since I don't think anything will ever top this. It's just so creative, so brilliantly animated, so fantastically scored, and so menacing and tense that I believe it absolutely deserves the status of being the best boss in this already phenomenal game. I love this boss and this game to death, and I can't wait to talk about it more in the future.
I be doing it to death and I move a little foul. Nigga better call a rap and everybody know my style. Niggas know that I'm the best when it comes to doing this. And I be banging on my chest and I bang in the east and I banging in the west. And I kinda give you more and I will never give you less. You will hear it in the street and you can read it in the press. Do you really wanna know what's next? Let's go. See the way we on it and we all up in the race. And you know we gotta go and try to keep up with the pace. And we struggling and hustle and sell it and get it and we go and gotta do it. Take it to another place. Gotta taste it and I gotta grab it and I gotta cut all through this traffic just to be at the top of the dome. But I know I